When we see someone defending a person, it makes us think, should the other person in that situation also be defended? That's a natural human impulse, but it also can cause harm if we let it run unchecked and we don't control. For example, I remember when I was much younger, and my grandmother was always a very strong supporter of Israel. She visited Israel. She was very staunch in her support for it. And I remember being young, being a child, and thinking that she was overlooking the ethical implications of the situation in Israel then and now. And I remember being inclined to support the other faction in a sense, not strongly, not overpoweringly, but in a sense, and being driven to observe whether perhaps the other side deserved consideration as well, because it seemed as though she was being very, very one-sided in it. And so, as I've grown older, of course, I see that the situation is much more complex than that, and I certainly don't adhere to one side or the other. But I think this illustrates that if we see one side being presented as the only side, the good side, and perhaps the sins of that side being overlooked, being pushed aside in order to present it as being perfect, we often are naturally inclined, out of our drive for justice, our desire for the right to prevail, we will often be driven to champion the other side, that which we see not being given a fair shake, that which we see being pushed aside, whose sins perhaps are being amplified while the other side's sins are being ignored, whose virtues are being marginalized, who is being squashed, who is being pushed down. It's a very natural human impulse. Often it can be used productively to seek a better balance, to find a better sort of justice between both sides. Not that everything is necessarily divided into two sides, of course. Often there are many sides, but it can be a good thing. It can help, but it can also be dangerous if we don't keep in mind what we're doing and what we're feeling and what we're thinking. If we simply become the opposite of what we are trying to provide a counterbalance to. If we simply take up the other side and pretend that the other side is perfect as an attempt to provide balance, as an attempt to balance the scales, then we are no different than what drove us to that position in the first place. And if we allow that to happen, then we may very well produce that same counter reaction in others who encounter us. Because if they see us championing one or another side and we simply do what others have already done, we present that side as perfect. We don't present a more level-headed, more multifaceted, more honest approach. If we don't provide a better perspective, then they will probably be driven, unless they already believe as we do, they will probably be driven to adopt an opposing stance, which will simply add more weight back to the original side of the problem, that will simply unbalance the scales again. The key thing here is to consider that it is good to try to provide a more balanced perspective. It is good to champion those who are being ignored, who are being villainized unfairly, who are the victims of one side or another, who is attempting to lionize their side and demonize the other. But if we simply become that which we are driven to oppose, then no good has truly been done, because we cannot balance the scales in totality. We cannot always even out how many people are on each side, how many people who believe one side or the other. We can't do that and then establish a perfect balance. So what we have to do is establish a perfect balance in ourselves. We have to strive to establish a perfect balance within each of our hearts and in each of our minds, and give voice to that perfect balance, and always be willing to consider that we have become unbalanced ourselves. In doing so, perhaps we can inspire a more balanced perspective and voice in others. And to do so, it would essentially remove the idea of it being a set of scales where one thing is measured against the other, and perhaps we could be a perfectly balanced thing in and of ourselves, something balancing stably, more stably than the scales, which are only measured in contrast to one weight or the other. And so if we give voice to a more balanced perspective in and of ourselves without necessarily relying on the perspective of another to provide a relative weight for us to measure ourselves against, then we can create what we sought to create in the first place, namely a more honest, insightful attitude that will take into account the good and the bad in everyone and everything, without minimizing, without maximalizing anything, good or bad, in either side. And we can finally move forward, and perhaps we can reach a better understanding, all of us together, by creating that balance within ourselves.